The first thing I noticed when I stepped out that morning wasn't the sunrise or the smell of fresh dew on the grass. It was a giant pink message sprayed across the side of my house in all caps neon. Violator HOA will decide your fate. I stood frozen in disbelief, coffee spilling from my mug as I processed the horror show painted on my freshly pressure-washed wall. I hadn't violated anything. My grass was trimmed, mailbox painted, trash bins tucked in. But there it was, like some dystopian HOA decree sent from the heavens, or more accurately, from someone's warped ego on the ground. I didn't have to guess who was behind it. Only one person in our neighborhood had the audacity, the arrogance, and the access to that particular shade of fluorescent pink. Karen Jefferson, self-appointed queen of the HOA and unofficial dictator of our cul-de-sac. The irony was rich. Just last week, she fined my neighbor Marcus for having a wind chime that was too melodic. Now this lunatic had turned my home into a billboard for HOA paranoia. And the best part? She had no clue my entire property was under 24-hour live feed surveillance. Or that feed didn't just record. It streamed directly to the county sheriff's office as part of a new neighborhood crime pilot program. Karen had officially spray-painted herself into a corner. I didn't touch the wall. I wanted every flake of paint, every accidental drip, to stay exactly where it was. I grabbed my phone and opened the security app. Within seconds, I was scrolling through timestamps until I found the moment at 2:41 a.m. There she was, in a hoodie with cat ears, creeping around the hedge like a third-rate cartoon villain. The footage showed her removing a can of spray paint from a canvas bag. Her dog, a jittery Pomeranian named Muffin, barked the entire time. The idiot even looked straight at the camera, not realizing the infrared lens was picking up every pixel of her ridiculous disguise. Her vanity plate, QUENKJ, was fully visible in the background, glinting under the streetlight. I nearly laughed. It was so dumb, it was poetic. But what came next made my jaw tighten. After finishing her graffiti masterpiece, she took a step back, admired her work, and muttered into the camera, "HOA justice is real." That was the final nail. This wasn't petty. It was a declaration of war. Still in my pajamas, I drove over to the HOA office building, just a renovated house 3 blocks away with a banner that read Community First stapled to the fence. I didn't walk in angry. I walked in calm. That's what really unsettled Karen. She was already there, sipping from a steaming mug that read HOA Queen, wearing her usual leopard print leggings and smug expression. When she saw me, her eyes flickered with fake surprise. "Oh, good morning," she said sweetly. "Did you see what those vandals did to your wall? Oh, it's just awful what's happening these days." I stared at her, speechless for a beat, more impressed than angry at her audacity. I asked if she had seen anything suspicious. She sipped again and said no, but hinted that my place had been attracting the wrong kind of energy lately. Probably because I had guests over past 10 on Saturday. She even winked. That wink was a confession wearing a mask. I walked out before I said something I'd regret. My next stop wasn't the hardware store or the neighborhood Facebook group. It was the sheriff's office. Deputy Marshal Stevens was already expecting me. Apparently, the AI in the surveillance system had flagged the footage and sent it in early that morning, identifying potential vandalism involving a recurring face. I didn't even have to explain much. Stevens offered me coffee, asked for permission to show the footage to his superiors, and said one thing that made everything click. "You know she's done this before, right? Not just you. We've got reports from 2 other neighborhoods. She moved here 2 years ago. One of them filed charges, but it never stuck. We're building a stronger case now. You just gave us our best footage yet." I walked out of the sheriff's office that day not as a victim, but as the keystone in a larger operation. Karen wasn't just my problem anymore. She was about to become a headline. That evening, the HOA sent out an emergency meeting notice. Same location. Mandatory attendance. The subject line simply read, "Addressing vandalism concerns." I knew what she was doing. Damage control. She thought she could spin this, rally the fearful, and maybe even paint herself as the heroic defender of HOA values against urban graffiti artists. What she didn't know was that I had downloaded the video onto a drive and printed out still frames with timestamp. Every shot was clear, crisp, and damning. The video wasn't just evidence. It was a movie. A tragicomedy starring Karen as the main villain. That night, I prepared my speech like I was going to court. Not angry. Just factual. Let the truth do its job. When I arrived at the community center, chairs were filled. Karen was already at the front, pacing like a dictator giving a press conference. She called the meeting to order and launched into a speech about lawlessness, disrespect, and the importance of order. She held up a paint can and dramatically tossed it in the trash, saying, "This is what we're up against." She even had the nerve to propose a community surveillance fund, ironically wanting to raise HOA dues for security cameras. I almost applauded the hypocrisy. But instead, I raised my hand. When acknowledged, I walked to the front, plugged in my USB drive, and said, "Funny thing about cameras. They don't lie." The projector lit up. Karen froze. There she was. Hoodie, pink can, dog barking. Her face visible in a side angle. She muttered, "HOA justice is real in perfect audio." The room gasped. One woman dropped her phone. Karen tried to interrupt. That could be anyone. That could be deepfake. But I handed out stills, each with timestamps and her license plate in view. The sheriff walked in mid-meltdown. "Karen Jefferson," he said calmly, "you need to come with us." She turned ghost white. Her mug slipped from her hand and shattered. The HOA queen was officially dethroned. Neighbors stared, whispering in shock, some in vindicated satisfaction. And I stood there thinking one thing. She thought she painted a message on my wall. But really, she signed her own downfall. The room remained frozen even after Karen was led out in handcuffs. No one dared to speak. Her shattered mug lay in pieces under the projector screen, and the last frame of the footage, her looking directly into the camera with the spray can raised, flickered behind it like a courtroom painting of shame. For a moment, it was as if the entire neighborhood had been shaken awake. People who had once nodded along to her every ridiculous HOA announcement were now looking at each other as if asking silently how they'd all let this happen. I gathered my papers without a word and walked out into the night, unsure if I had just triggered justice or ignited chaos. The next morning, things were far from quiet. By 7 a.m., 3 HOA board members had resigned via email, citing stress, fear of legal fallout, and claims of having been bullied by Karen. I wasn't surprised. Karen had ruled through passive aggression and veiled threat. She'd fine people for mailbox flags not matching community colors and issue warnings over garden gnomes. Most people just gave in to keep the peace. Now that she was exposed, they were scrambling like rats off a sinking ship. At around 9 a.m., I got a call from one of the board members who hadn't resigned. Her name was Camille, and she'd always kept a low profile at meetings. She confessed that she'd suspected Karen for months, but didn't have the nerve to go against her. She thanked me for standing up, but also warned me. There was still a group of residents loyal to Karen, either out of fear or because they believed her bizarre claims that the neighborhood was under threat from outsiders. She told me that some of them were already trying to spin the narrative, saying I must have doctored the footage or set Karen up. I wasn't shocked. Denial is always the first reaction when a bully gets caught. But I was prepared. I had backups of everything: video, audio, emails, and most importantly, the sheriff's own written confirmation of the investigation. Later that day, a follow-up HOA meeting was announced. This time, it was billed as a restabilization gathering. Whatever that meant, I knew it was going to be more like a damage assessment. When I arrived, it was obvious the tone had changed. Gone were the smug coffee mugs and power-walking gossiper. People sat stiffly, whispering in hushed tones, eyes darting to the empty seat where Karen used to sit. Camille stood at the front and addressed everyone with a mixture of grace and tremble. She announced that the HOA was temporarily suspending all enforcement actions, and a third-party legal review was underway to audit all of Karen's past decisions. There were audible gasps. One man asked if his $300 fine for a non-regulation bird feeder would be refunded. Camille didn't laugh. She just said, "Keep your receipts." That line hit like a thunderclap. Suddenly, dozens of people began asking about fines, citations, fence color disputes, and denied pool permit. The dam had broken. Karen had been the glue holding together a very crooked system, and now that glue was melting under the pressure of legal sunlight. Then things escalated. A woman named Priya, who lived 2 doors down from me, stood up and held out her phone. She played an old voicemail. It was Karen's voice, unmistakably snide, threatening to revoke Priya's landscaping privileges if she didn't take down her prayer flags. Another neighbor played a similar recording. Within 15 minutes, at least 5 residents had shared proof that Karen had issued personal threats disguised as policy enforcement. Camille looked overwhelmed. That's when I stepped up and asked to speak. I explained how Karen had not only targeted me but that she had left a trail of paranoia and false authority. I reminded them of how she'd played people against each other, weaponized HOA bylaws, and then defaced my home as some kind of deranged message. I asked the room to consider what kind of community they wanted. One that lived in fear of pink spray paint and HOA notices, or one that actually helped each other out. The room didn't applaud, but the silence that followed felt heavier than noise. It was the silence of realization. Camille took the mic and asked for nominations for a temporary leadership committee. Several people nominated me. I didn't expect that. I hesitated but accepted. The truth was, I didn't want to be in charge. I just didn't want another Karen to take over while everyone was too stunned to act. The vote was immediate. I was named acting co-chair alongside Camille and an elderly gentleman named Hank who had lived in the community since it was built. We scheduled a formal audit and opened a suggestion box, both physical and digital, for people to submit past issues, fines, and Karen-related grievances. That night, I received over 70 emails. Some were just questions, but many were horror stories. One woman said Karen had made her remove a swing set because it was visible from the street. Another man said Karen fined him for parking his own truck in his own driveway for more than 2 hours. And another revealed Karen had denied a permit to build a ramp for his wheelchair-bound son, claiming it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. I couldn't believe the layers of cruelty. The next morning, the sheriff's department called. They wanted to expand the investigation. Apparently, someone had found a stash of HOA documents in Karen's garage, ones that weren't part of official records. There were vote tallies that didn't match any public decisions and bylaw edits that had never been approved. It was clear Karen had been editing rules to her own liking, enforcing fake codes, and collecting fines into an unofficial HOA beautification fund. The sheriff asked if I could help verify some signatures. I agreed and headed down to the station. What I saw there was even worse than expected. The altered documents were typed up but clearly forged. Some of the supposed votes approving Karen's policies had names of residents who had moved out years ago, or in one case, had passed away. I felt sick. This wasn't just abuse of power. It was fraud. Real, prosecutable fraud. The sheriff informed me they would be filing additional charges against Karen, including falsifying legal documents and financial misconduct. I asked him if we would ever get that money back. He said probably not all of it, but with enough evidence, some could be recovered. By the time I left the station, I wasn't thinking about the pink spray paint anymore. That had just been the match. What Karen did went far deeper than vandalism. She'd manipulated an entire neighborhood with lies, fake laws, and fake fines. And while she was currently sitting in a cell, sipping government coffee and waiting for arraignment, the real cleanup was just beginning. Back at home, I sat on the porch and watched neighbors walk by. They were different now. Nods turned into conversations. Fences that had once been divisive were now just wooden slats between friends. A kid rode his bike across 3 lawns without getting scolded. People had started breathing again. And I realized something. Karen may have tried to mark my wall with her authority, but in doing so, she marked the end of her reign. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a neighborhood that finally remembered how to stand up for itself. The quiet that settled over the neighborhood in the days after Karen's arrest was almost eerie. For years, her voice had been the loudest one, her rules the most enforced, her gaze the most feared. Now there was a kind of uneasy peace. Lawns still got mowed, kids still rode bikes, and sprinklers still clicked to life at 6 a.m., but there was a collective sense of holding breath. Everyone knew this wasn't over. Her absence was just the surface. The rot she left behind ran much deeper. The HOA was now under a temporary leadership team, and I found myself unexpectedly immersed in a world of documents, files, and rulebooks that looked more like a dictatorship's toolkit than a community's guide. The more we uncovered, the uglier it got. Camille had obtained access to Karen's official HOA email account, which had been registered through the neighborhood's own domain. The inbox was a goldmine of ego. There were messages to board members threatening them with votes of no confidence if they dared to contradict her. There were drafts of emails she never sent but wrote to blow off steam, calling residents garbage aesthetics or property value terrorists. It was shocking, yes, but more than anything, it was strategic. Karen had constructed a web of manipulation, carefully weaving her control through backdoor votes, policy tweaks, and ambiguous language. She never held power directly. She manufactured the illusion that she always had support, that rules were being followed, when in fact, she was writing the rules as she went. The audit team we brought in, a small firm specializing in nonprofit governance, was blown away. They said they'd seen fraud before, but never in a residential HOA at this scale. Karen had established shell accounts labeled Beautification Reserve and Emergency Security Fund. Dues paid by residents were siphoned into these fake reserves. She had used them for personal expenditures, spa days, clothing, home decor. One receipt showed a charge for $212 worth of yoga pants listed under community wellness. It would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. When we presented the evidence to the sheriff's office, they added embezzlement and misappropriation of funds to the charges. I kept thinking about the families who struggled to pay those fines. I remembered an elderly neighbor, Mr. Ramirez, who Karen fined 3 times in 1 month for minor paint chips on his window frames. He had quietly taken out a small loan to keep up with payments. I went to visit him, shared what we had found, and watched tears form in his eyes. He didn't say much, just patted my hand and whispered thank you. The fallout wasn't just legal. It was emotional. Neighbors began to come forward with stories of Karen's cruelty. A single mother said Karen once threatened to report her to child services because her kids played with chalk on the driveway. Another resident revealed that Karen demanded they cut down a fruit tree because it attracted birds that looked too wild. The stories weren't just absurd, they were personal attacks masked as regulation. One by one, the facade of order Karen had built was reduced to rubble. But in the ashes, something new was forming. People began knocking on each other's doors. Apologies were made. Fences once argued over were now being offered up as shared painting projects. A few residents organized a weekend barbecue, and instead of fines, flyers were handed out. I showed up and saw something I hadn't seen in months: laughter. Real, relaxed, uninhibited laughter. But not everything was healing. Karen still had supporters, some vocal, some subtle. A few claimed the charges were exaggerated, a witch hunt started by me because I didn't like her policies. One man named Harold even tried to start a petition to reinstate Karen until the legal proceedings were over, claiming innocent until proven guilty. The petition gathered exactly 4 signatures, one of them Karen's niece who didn't live in the community. But the attempt rattled us. We couldn't take chances. Camille and I pushed for a formal HOA bylaw restructuring. We drafted clear language preventing any single individual from making enforcement decisions, implemented transparency requirements for all financial transactions, and added term limits for board members. We also proposed a rule requiring community votes for any policy changes over $200. The meeting to ratify these new measures was the most attended HOA meeting in the neighborhood's history. We expected resistance, but the vote was nearly unanimous. The few who dissented didn't argue. They simply stayed quiet. One woman who had always backed Karen offered a faint apology afterward. She said she didn't realize how bad it had gotten. Maybe that was true. Or maybe she just wanted to avoid being on the wrong side of a sinking ship. Either way, it didn't matter. The reforms passed. Karen's reign had officially been erased from the rulebook. Around that time, the sheriff called again. During a deeper search of Karen's home, they had found a locked drawer filled with unauthorized files, printouts of emails from residents, surveillance photos taken without permission, and folders labeled with first names like threat. One of them had my name on it. Inside were screenshots of my property from various angles, notes about when my car came and went, and even copies of messages I'd posted in the HOA group chat questioning her decisions. It was chilling. The sheriff assured me I was never in physical danger, but the intent was clear. Karen saw herself not as an administrator, but as a ruler over subjects she monitored and controlled. The spray paint had just been the moment she slipped. Too bold, too personal. And that mistake had pulled the curtain all the way back. The file also contained her resignation letter. It was never sent. It read like the speech of a tyrant stepping down because her people weren't worthy. She blamed everyone but herself, calling the community weak, disloyal, and ungrateful. She referred to the spray painting as a necessary wake-up call, a symbolic act of leadership. That document was submitted to the court as further evidence of her intent and mental state. She was deemed unfit to return to any leadership role in residential governance pending the outcome of her trial. At home, I sat on my porch again and watched the neighborhood move around me. Camille and Hank joined me for iced tea. We didn't talk about bylaws or investigations. We talked about birds, dogs, the weather. It felt good, peaceful. Then Hank chuckled and asked if I'd seen the new mural being painted on the old HOA office wall. I hadn't. He described it. A bright, community-designed piece showing houses with open doors, kids playing, and in the corner, a small pink can of spray paint with a big red X through it. Art therapy, someone had called it. A reminder, not just of Karen's actions, but of the unity that followed. We finished our tea in silence. I looked over at my own wall, still scarred by the original message. I hadn't painted over it. Not yet. Not because I liked seeing it, but because it reminded me of what we'd all come through. And maybe, when the time was right, we'd turn it into something better. A mural. A story. A symbol that even the worst abuses of power could be scrubbed away, repainted with community, truth, and something HOA Karen never understood, genuine respect. By the time a month had passed since Karen's arrest, the neighborhood felt like it had been split into two timelines. There was the time before the spray paint, before the hidden files and the hush-hush fines, before the constant fear of receiving one of Karen's icy HOA notices for something as trivial as planting daisies an inch too wide from the sidewalk. Then there was now, a time of cautious optimism, spontaneous community potlucks, and neighbors who finally knew each other's names. But even with the air lighter and the fences less metaphorical, the work of repairing what Karen had broken was far from finished. For all her obsessive control, Karen had also left behind a chaotic mess. Dozens of decisions she had made as HOA president were now in dispute. People wanted their money back, their fines reversed, their permits reproved. It wasn't just about fairness. It was about restoration. Camille and I, along with Hank and 2 new temporary board members, were now coordinating with the audit team and the sheriff's office almost daily. We had set up an open-door policy at the HOA building. Residents could bring in any Karen-related notices, citations, or strange letters and have them reviewed. It turned out Karen had issued over 90 citations in her final 3 months alone. 90. and only about 20 of them were even remotely valid. The rest were outright lies. One homeowner had been fined for an invisible trash can, as Karen claimed it, could be seen in spirit through the neighbor's window. Another had been told their porch light was too aggressive. She actually used that phrase in writing. Aggressive lighting. We ended up with an entire bulletin board covered in her ridiculous notices. It was absurd enough to laugh at, but the residents affected hadn't found it funny when they had been paying those fines or living in fear of new ones. We decided to take those letters and turn them into a kind of art wall, framed reminders of what happens when one person is allowed too much power without check. The bigger task, though, was money. The HOA accounts were a tangled web of real and fake entries. Karen had been clever about disguising personal purchases under vague community headings. She had bought $500 worth of scented candles labeled neighborhood morale items. She'd expensed a weekend getaway with the note, HOA Leadership Strategic Planning. Even the printer in the HOA office had been replaced with a luxury model listed under Emergency Document Response Unit. It would have been funny if it didn't total over $30,000 in misused funds. The sheriff's office was preparing a full restitution demand as part of the case against her. But recovering those funds would take time, and not everyone could wait. Several elderly residents had paid Karen's fake fines on fixed incomes. Camille and I sat down and created a temporary relief fund using voluntary donations from within the community, matching them with board stipends that none of us were using. Within a week, we had raised over $12,000, enough to reimburse at least the most egregious cases. One of those cases was a single father named Jake. Karen had fined him repeatedly for leaving his garage door open while his son played with Legos on the driveway. She claimed it was a violation of community appearance standard. The man had ended up selling some of his tools to cover the mounting fines. When I handed him a check to cover the amount he had paid plus a little extra, he looked stunned. He didn't say thank you right away. He just stared at it, then looked at me and said, "You know, she made me feel like I was doing everything wrong even when I was just trying to raise my kid." I told him he wasn't alone. Dozens of people had shared that same feeling. It was how Karen operated. She built power by making everyone else feel small. Meanwhile, Karen's legal situation was getting worse by the week. At her preliminary hearing, the evidence presented included the surveillance footage, the fake financial records, and a growing list of victim statements from residents. The judge didn't mince words. He called her actions deliberate and systemic. Her defense team tried to argue mental stress from the pandemic had led her to poor decisions, but it was weak, especially when the prosecution introduced her unsent resignation letter as evidence, the one that blamed everyone but herself. The court froze her assets and set a date for a full trial. But in a bizarre twist, the day after the hearing, her car was found parked in the HOA building lot, the same spot she used to reserve for herself with a handmade sign that read HOA President Only. It was covered in citations from residents, joking ones, now that she no longer held power. They had taped them to the windshield like love notes from Karma. Then something unexpected happened. A brown package arrived at my front door, no return label. Inside was Karen's old HOA-issued laptop, still operational. It had likely been taken by someone during the cleanup of her house or office, maybe to preserve evidence, maybe as a keepsake. The drive wasn't password protected. I booted it up and immediately found a folder titled Master Control. Inside were detailed drafts of fake citations, templates for bylaw updates, and even a Photoshop file of the community map she used to mark homes as target. But more shocking was a document labeled Problem People. It was a running list of residents with notes beside each name. Mine read, surveillance risk, potential threat, keep isolated. Others had things like weak-willed, manipulate easily or already compliant, exploit. It was every bit as creepy as it sounds. I printed the file and took it straight to the sheriff's office. They were stunned. This would be the final nail, they said. Premeditated abuse of authority on record, in her own words. They were adding new charges to the case. Word of the document spread through the neighborhood quickly. Some people were angry. Others were just hurt. It was hard to reconcile how someone you waved at every morning could be writing your name on a hit list for fines. But even as emotions flared, something amazing started to happen. The residents on that list, the so-called problem people, began to connect. We met, exchanged stories, and laughed in disbelief at some of the things we'd gone through. One woman brought a cake shaped like a pink spray can. Another made t-shirts that read official HOA threat with Karen's mugshot in the background. It turned into a movement. Neighbors who had once been isolated by fear were now building bonds because of it. The community began planning a mural together, a permanent one to cover the side wall of the HOA office. The theme was resilience. Local artists, kids, and retirees came together to sketch it out. One panel showed a house covered in vines and light, symbolizing growth after neglect. Another depicted a broken crown lying in grass, a nod to the fall of Karen's reign. In one corner, there was a small security camera with a speech bubble saying "Nice try." The mural wasn't just paint. It was closure. Looking back, it still felt surreal. A few months ago, I was worried about being fined for not rolling my trash bins back within 30 minutes. Now I was part of a leadership team reshaping the very foundation of our community. And while I hadn't asked for this role, I realized it had become something bigger than HOA politics. It was about standing up when no one else would, and watching others rise behind you. It was about turning a wall of threats into a canvas of healing. Karen had tried to write the final chapter of our neighborhood's story in neon pink rage. Instead, she gave us the opening line of a better one. The day Karen was sentenced was strangely quiet. There was no dramatic scene, no shouting or sobbing, no last-minute twist or attempt to flee the courtroom. Just a simple statement from the judge, a stern glare at the defense, and the gavel that echoed softly through the room like a door clicking shut. 18 months in county jail for vandalism, fraud, falsifying legal documents, harassment, and misappropriation of funds. Restitution ordered. Prohibited from participating in any housing authority, homeowners association, or residential governing body in the state. And perhaps the final blow to her ego, court-mandated community service specifically involving public cleanup efforts, particularly graffiti removal. The irony was so poetic it almost felt scripted. Karen didn't speak as the sentence was read. Her face was pale, emotionless, like all the life had been vacuumed out of her carefully crafted persona. The HOA queen had become the HOA cautionary tale. Back in the neighborhood, we didn't throw a party. We didn't dance or cheer. We moved forward. The mural on the old HOA wall was completed, and it was stunning. Bright colors, open windows, birds in flight, kids on bikes, elderly neighbors smiling across fences. And in the far bottom corner, a tiny pink spray can with a faint red X over it, not to mock, but to remember. The space had transformed into more than just a wall. It became a symbol, a place where people came to reflect, to sit on the nearby bench and watch the sunset, to drink coffee in peace. We had decided together not to erase what had happened, but to grow around it. The newly formed HOA board became more transparent than any of us imagined. We held monthly town halls under string lights in the community garden instead of the sterile, stuffy meeting room Karen used to preside over. Residents brought food, kids ran around barefoot, and decisions were made with real votes, visible counts, and open discussion. The atmosphere was less formal, more honest. Even disagreements felt productive. People actually listened. There were still rules, of course, but now they made sense. They weren't weapons. They were guardrails. We finally understood what a homeowners association could be when it was run with integrity instead of control. We also started something new, a community advisory panel. No power, just a rotating group of 5 residents each month who could voice concerns, bring up ideas, and speak for those who didn't always feel heard. One of the first people to sign up was Mr. Ramirez, the elderly man Karen had fined for chipped paint. He now chaired the beautification project and led a weekly paint and repair crew of volunteers who went door to door helping seniors and those with disabilities maintain their homes. The man who had once been bullied into submission now stood proudly in his overalls, paintbrush in hand, restoring dignity one stroke at a time. The most touching moment came when a young boy named Aiden, maybe 10 years old, handed me a folded note during one of the garden town halls. It said, "Thank you for making my mom not cry anymore." I knew immediately who he was. His mother had been one of Karen's favorite targets, fined for everything from curtain color to lawn height. I'd seen her cry during the early meetings, terrified she'd be evicted or publicly humiliated. Now she walked through the garden smiling, sometimes even laughing. She'd recently been approved to start a small weekend art class for kids on her front lawn. No more permits, no more threats. Just community. But despite all the progress, there was one final chapter still being written. The court had awarded limited restitution to be paid to the HOA fund from Karen's seized asset. We didn't expect much. Most of the money had been spent, hidden, or was simply unrecoverable. Still, it was enough to launch a new initiative we called Karen's Legacy, tongue-in-cheek, of course. It was a scholarship fund for young residents pursuing studies in law, ethics, or public service. It was funded in part by donations, but also by what little remained of Karen's once rigid empire. If she had taken from the community, then the community would rebuild with it, not out of vengeance, but out of purpose. A few months later, during a scheduled cleanup event, we received word that Karen would be fulfilling her court-ordered service at a park just outside our neighborhood. Nobody made a scene. There were no protests or cameras, but a few of us went, quietly, to see with our own eyes. Karen wore a neon vest, gloves, and a grimace. She was scrubbing faded graffiti from a concrete underpass while a county officer stood nearby watching. For someone who once claimed to be defending the beauty of the neighborhood, she didn't look the part anymore. She looked tired, shrunken, and empty. I didn't feel smug. I didn't feel angry either. I just watched her for a minute, then turned to leave. As I walked away, I caught her eye. She looked up, met my gaze for a split second, then looked back down at the ground. No words passed between us. None were needed. Later that evening, I returned to my own wall, the one she had defaced all those months ago. It had been left blank since the cleanup. I'd kept meaning to repaint it, but somehow I couldn't bring myself to. Now I knew why. That space wasn't just a reminder of what had happened. It was an opportunity. I pulled out a small box of paint, a brush, and began to work. By nightfall, the message that once read "Violator HOA will decide your fate" was replaced with something new. "This wall belongs to US." It wasn't just about my home anymore. It was about everyone who had stood up, spoken out, and decided enough was enough. The story spread. A local newspaper did a small piece on our transformation, and soon it went viral online. The headline read, "From Fear to Flowers: How One Neighborhood Overthrew Its HOA Tyrant." Messages poured in from other communities around the country. People asked for advice, told us their own Karen stories, and shared their hopes of taking back control from toxic HOA board. We compiled our experience into a guidebook and offered it free online. Our community became an example not of victimhood, but of action, resilience, and collective voice. Every so often, I get asked if I'd go through it all again. The fines, the vandalism, the threats, the meetings, the stress. And every time I say yes. Because it wasn't just about me or my wall. It was about what happened when one person tried to bully a whole neighborhood into silence and control, and how that neighborhood woke up, linked arms, and pushed back. We weren't perfect. We stumbled. We argued. We doubted. But we stood. And when we did, the entire foundation Karen built on fear and manipulation came crashing down. Now, each morning when I sip my coffee on the porch, I look out and see something she never did. Not just houses, but homes. Not just fences, but friendships. Not just rules, but understanding. And in that quiet, I smile. knowing that one can of spray paint didn't destroy us. It woke us up, and we're never going back to sleep again.